A woman, 42 years old, standing alone on a sidewalk in the middle of a gray November afternoon. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill your skin, it gets into your bones, into the spaces between your ribs, and just sits there. She has 2 garbage bags at her feet. That's it. That's everything. 2 black plastic garbage bags stuffed with whatever she managed to grab before the locks were changed. A few shirts, a pair of boots, some photographs, a broken hairdryer she kept meaning to throw out anyway, and a journal she hasn't opened since the week she got married. She's standing in front of what used to be her house. Not the house she grew up in, the house she chose, the house she painted and planted and cleaned and kept and stayed up worrying about the mortgage in. The house where she had believed year after year that she was building something real. There's a sold sign in the yard. It went up 3 days ago. The garden she planted herself, roses, lavender, a little stone path she laid brick by brick one spring weekend, is already starting to look like it belongs to someone else. She doesn't cry. Not yet. She just stands there, staring. Like if she looks long enough, the story will change. Like the ending will rewrite itself. Her phone buzzes. It's her sister Carol. 3 words. Come stay with me. Diana Mercer, because that's her name, Diana, doesn't respond right away. She reads it twice. Then she picks up her garbage bags and starts walking. She doesn't know yet that this walk, this humiliating, gut-wrenching, rock-bottom walk is not the end of her story. She doesn't know that in 12 days in the attic of her sister's house, she is going to pull a dresser away from a wall and find something that has been waiting there for over 80 years. She doesn't know that what's hidden in that wall is going to change the way she understands loss, love, time, and the quiet persistence of things that refuse to disappear. Welcome to Dreams Never Grow Old, where we share stories of hope, resilience, and second chances that will touch your heart. If you enjoy stories about chasing dreams, overcoming obstacles, and finding purpose, don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay with me. Because Diana's story is one of the most quietly devastating and ultimately beautiful things I have ever had the privilege of telling. And it starts, as most important stories do, long before the moment we think it begins. To understand what Diana lost, that you have to understand what she came from. And to understand what she came from, you have to go back to a small town in Ohio, to a narrow 2-story house with a green roof and a front porch that sagged a little on the left side, where a woman named Ruth Mercer raised 3 daughters on double shifts and sheer unbreakable will. Ruth worked at a textile factory. She was on her feet for 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. She came home smelling of machine oil and fabric and something that her daughters could never quite name, but always associated with safety. She made dinner every night, not elaborate dinners. Most nights it was soup or beans or pasta with whatever was in the cabinet, but it was always on the table, hot. And the 4 of them sat together and ate it and talked about their days. And that ritual, that simple, ordinary ritual, was the scaffolding that held everything else up. Ruth's husband, the girl's father, had left when Diana was 6. She doesn't talk about him much. What she'll say, if you ask her carefully, is that he was a man who was better at beginning things than finishing them. He loved them, she thinks, in the way some people love, brightly, and not quite reliably. There were birthday cards for several years, and then there weren't. Diana has not seen him since she was 14. Carol was the oldest, 5 years older than Diana and a completely different creature. Where Diana was quiet, Carol was loud. Where Diana hesitated, Carol charged. Carol was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately made it better, funnier, warmer, more alive. Now she got into trouble with regularity and got out of it with equal ease. She laughed at everything, including herself, and especially at the people who took themselves too seriously. Carol had been the one, when Diana was 12, who sat with her through an entire difficult night after a bad dream and told her stories until she fell asleep. She had been the one who showed up at Diana's college graduation with a poster and balloons when nobody else was able to make the drive. She was, in the private accounting of Diana's life, one of the most reliable credits on the ledger. Then there was Tess, the youngest, 3 years younger than Diana. Tess was wild in the way that only the youngest child can be wild. As if having older sisters had pre-absorbed all the rules and left Tess with a kind of beautiful, dangerous freedom. She ran away for a summer at 17, came back with stories she told in pieces over the years, never quite completing them. She moved to the West Coast eventually, became a potter, lived in a converted barn. They talked on birthdays and holidays and whenever someone was in crisis. And then there was Diana, the middle one, the steady one, the one who showed up early and stayed late and did things right the first time so she wouldn't have to do them again. Her mother's phrase for her was, "My reliable girl," and Diana had always received that as a compliment, though she would wonder, later, whether reliability had become a way of making herself invisible, whether being the dependable one had been in some ways a way of taking up as little space as possible and calling it virtue. Yet she put herself through community college working nights at a diner. She was good at the work, good with people, good at managing the controlled chaos of a busy floor, good at keeping her composure when everything was going sideways. She graduated with an associate degree in business administration and got a job as a coordinator at a regional accounting firm called Hartwell and Associates. She was 23. She was efficient and organized and completely indispensable within 6 months. Her boss, a man named Gerald Hartwell, who wore the same 3 suits on rotation and kept a framed photograph of a border collie on his desk, called her the only person in this office who actually reads the whole email before responding. It was, Diana thought, one of the finest compliments she had ever received. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't ambitious in the way some people mean that word. She didn't lie awake dreaming of corner offices or industry conferences. What she wanted was simpler and, in some ways, harder to achieve. She wanted to build something solid, something that would last. She had grown up in a house held together by her mother's exhausted love and very little else. She had watched Ruth count money at the kitchen table late at night with the particular silent concentration of someone doing math that has to come out right. She had learned early that the world did not promise you stability. You had to build it yourself, carefully, and protect it. She met Marcus Holloway at a work conference when she was 28. He was 34, sharp-jawed, well-dressed, and charming in a way that immediately made Diana suspicious. Too smooth. Too easy with compliments. The kind of man who seemed to know exactly what to say at exactly the right moment, and in Diana's experience, that kind of fluency usually meant the words didn't cost him anything. But he was persistent, and he was patient, which surprised her. He called when he said he would. He showed up when he said he would. He asked her questions, and then actually listened to the answers, which, in her experience, was rarer than it should be. After 3 months of careful, measured, getting to know you, she let herself like him. After 6 months, she let herself love him. She introduced him to her mother on a Sunday in April. Ruth made pot roast. Marcus brought wine and talked easily and helped clear the table without being asked. Ruth caught Diana in the kitchen afterward and said quietly, "He's a keeper, that one. Just make sure you're keeping the right parts." Diana had turned that sentence over in her head many times since then. They married when Diana was 30, a small ceremony in a garden, not a lavish wedding, but a warm, real gathering of the people who mattered. Carol gave a toast that was somehow both funny and devastating in the way only Carol could manage. Tess flew in from the West Coast and cried throughout the ceremony, which surprised everyone, including Tess. Ruth wore a blue dress and danced with Marcus during the last song of the night, and Diana stood at the edge of the dance floor watching them and thought, "This is it. This is the solid thing." It was a good day. Diana has never doubted that. The marriage, in the beginning, was genuinely fine. Not extraordinary. She would tell you that honestly, without bitterness, in the way you speak about things you've made peace with. But fine. They bought a house in the suburbs of Columbus. Diana kept her job at the firm and worked her way up to senior coordinator. Marcus was in finance, moving through positions at a regional investment firm, climbing steadily. They talked about having children, though the conversation always circled and landed somewhere inconclusive, and then life moved on, and the conversation circled again. They had routines. They had their preferred restaurants and their Sunday morning rhythms, and their running jokes. Diana planted a garden. Marcus built a deck. They had neighbors over for dinner. They argued sometimes. About money, mostly. About Marcus's tendency to make purchases without discussing them first. But the arguments resolved. Or seemed to. It was a life. A real, ordinary, imperfect life. And Diana, who had grown up in a house held together by so much invisible effort, was quietly, deeply grateful for it. She didn't see it ending. That perhaps was the thing that hurt most, not the ending itself, but how completely she had failed to see it coming. Looking back, Diana will tell you the signs were there. She'll say this calmly, without drama, the way you talk about something you've spent a long time making peace with. She'll say, "The signs were there, and I either didn't see them or I saw them and told myself a story about them that made them mean something else." Marcus started working longer hours when Diana was 34. She was 35 when she noticed that he had stopped telling her about his day in any detail. Not dramatically. Not a sudden shift, but a slow withdrawal. I'd like water draining from a bathtub, so gradually you don't realize the water's gone cold until you're shivering. He became critical in small ways, not loudly, not cruelly, not in the way that would have been obvious, that would have been easy to name and respond to. It was more like a low-grade static, a slight edge in the voice. Comments offered as jokes that landed somewhere between observation and insult. You always take things so literally. You're too cautious about everything. You never really understood how money works. He said these things lightly, and Diana absorbed them lightly, and neither of them acknowledged how consistently they accumulated. She told herself it was stress. Finance was a brutal industry. Long hours, high stakes, the kind of pressure that followed you home and sat at the dinner table with you. She tried to give him space. She tried to be steady. She was, after all, the reliable one. She was 37 when she first noticed something was off with their finances. Not wrong exactly, just off. A joint account that seemed lower than it should be. A credit card statement she couldn't quite reconcile with the purchases she remembered making. She asked Marcus about it. He had an explanation. The explanation was plausible. She accepted it. She was 38 when she found a statement for an account she hadn't known existed, a savings account in Marcus's name only. She asked about it. He was annoyed, not guilty, not caught out, just mildly irritated, as though she was making something out of nothing. Said it was an old account from before they were married, barely any money in it. He'd forgotten to mention it. He was convincing. And he was always convincing. She was 39 when she found the second account. And a third. She didn't confront him about those. She didn't know why exactly, except that something in her, some quiet, observant part that she had learned early to ignore in the interest of keeping things smooth, told her that confronting him would change things in ways she wasn't ready for. So she watched. And she waited. And she tried to understand what she was looking at. The way you try to understand a word in a foreign language, by observing how it's used in context. She was 41 when Marcus asked for a divorce. It happened on a Tuesday evening in March. She was making pasta. He walked into the kitchen, sat down at the table, and said, "I think we should end the marriage." She turned from the stove. She looked at him. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, very still, the way you sit when you have practiced something. Later, she would try to remember what she felt in that exact moment, and the most honest answer she could find was, not surprised. Not surprised in the way you'd expect. There was shock. The body's sudden rearrangement around a new reality, a physical recalibration. But underneath the shock was something almost like recognition, like a word she had been trying to remember for years, finally surfacing. Like the thing she had been refusing to know, finally insisting on being known. He had a lawyer. He had already retained a lawyer, a firm called Brannock, Slade, and Weir that specialized in high-asset divorces. Diana hadn't known they had high assets. She scrambled to find her own attorney. She found a woman named Linda Ferris, who came with good recommendations and a reputation for fighting hard. But Linda would tell her in their second meeting that they were already behind, that the other side had been preparing for this for a long time, longer than Diana knew. The financial investigation that followed revealed a picture that Diana had to sit with for several days before she could look at it directly. Marcus had been moving money for at least 4 years, consistently, methodically, in small amounts that were just below the threshold that would trigger automatic flags, through a network of accounts opened gradually and deliberately. He had refinanced their house twice in the past 3 years. Diana had signed the documents without understanding what she was signing, because Marcus had always handled that side of things. And she had trusted him, and this, she now understood, had been a form of blindness she had chosen. He had transferred marital assets into investments registered solely in his name. He had been building an exit for 4 years, while Diana had been building a life. The proceedings took 14 months. Marcus's legal team was efficient and well-resourced and experienced at delay. They filed motions. They contested valuations. They challenged every document. They wore Diana's legal fund down with the patient, grinding thoroughness of people who have done this before and will do it again. At the end, Linda told her, "This is the best settlement we can get. I know it doesn't feel like justice. I'm sorry." Diana walked out of the courthouse with a cash settlement of $41,000. Legal fees ate $32,000 of that. And she had $9,000, 2 garbage bags, and no home. She was 42 years old. She stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse for 11 minutes. She remembers this because she counted, because counting was something to do with the part of her mind that couldn't simply stand still. And then she picked up her bags and she called Carol, and Carol answered on the first ring. Carol Mercer had never married. If you asked her why, she would give you a different answer depending on her mood and how much she liked you. Sometimes she said she'd never found anyone interesting enough to commit to. Sometimes she said she preferred solitude the way other people prefer sunlight, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Sometimes she said, and with the particular directness that was her natural mode, I watched my mother hold everything together alone for 20 years. I decided early that alone was something I could manage reliably, and together was something I'd have to audition considerably more carefully before signing on. She had been teaching art at Jefferson High School for 22 years. She was the kind of teacher students remembered for the rest of their lives. Not because she was easy, but because she saw them. She had a gift for looking at a teenager's clumsy, uncertain work and finding in it the thing worth keeping, worth developing, the thing that was genuinely theirs and not just a copy of something they'd been told art was supposed to look like. She had bought her house, a modest 2-story on Elm Creek Road, surrounded by old oak trees whose roots had long since made the sidewalk uneven, 15 years earlier. She had painted the front door yellow. She grew herbs in the kitchen window. She had 2 cats, a large gray one named Fitzgerald and a small tabby one named Plath. She had a wall in her living room covered entirely with film posters, framed postcards, and student artwork. She had what she referred to as a serious relationship with a particular brand of dark roast coffee. When Diana called from the courthouse parking lot, Carol's first words were, "Are you safe?" Diana said, "Yes." Carol said, "Then get in a cab. Come here. Everything else is later." Diana arrived at Carol's house at 6:15 in the evening. She stood at the door with her garbage bags, and Carol pulled her inside without ceremony. The way you pull someone in from the rain, quickly, practically without making a production of it. She sat Diana down at the kitchen table. She put the kettle on. She fed Fitzgerald and Plath, who were making their feelings about the disruption known. And then she sat across from her sister and talked. Not about the divorce, not about Marcus, not about money or what came next or whether Diana was going to be okay. She talked about a student who had painted an extraordinary mural that week, about a documentary she'd watched about migratory birds, about a restaurant on 5th Street that had opened a new outdoor section. She gave Diana 2 hours of ordinary conversation, of the world continuing to exist in its small, manageable way, right alongside the catastrophe. It was exactly what Diana needed, and then Carol knew it was exactly what Diana needed, and neither of them said so out loud. After tea, Carol showed her the attic. The staircase was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and the door at the top was painted white and had a small ceramic knob shaped like a daisy. Carol had to duck through the doorway. Diana, several inches shorter, did not. The attic was low-ceilinged and slant-roofed, with exposed wooden beams that had darkened over decades to a deep, warm brown. The floor was bare wood, old planks, wide and slightly uneven, that creaked softly underfoot. On the far wall, which angled sharply with the roofline, there was a single round window, about 18 inches across, that looked out over Carol's backyard and the oak trees beyond it. Carol had prepared the space carefully. There was a twin bed pushed against the straight wall, made up with a patchwork quilt that Diana recognized the moment she saw it. It was their grandmother's. Their mother's mother, Evelyn, had made it square by square, year after year, from scraps of fabric that came from things that had been worn out or outgrown. It had lived in various closets and cedar chests throughout Diana's childhood, brought out for company or for sick days, smelling faintly of lavender and old wood. There was a lamp on a wooden crate, a small dresser against the far wall, a space heater in the corner, and along the slanted wall a row of shelves still loaded with boxes. Decades of accumulated family things. Old photo albums, a bread tin full of buttons, a box of Christmas ornaments wrapped in newspaper from 1987, a sewing kit that had belonged to their grandmother. "I know it's small," Carol said. "I know it's not what you're used to, but it's yours for as long as you need it. No conditions, no timeline, no checking in." And Diana looked at the quilt on the bed. She said, "It's perfect." Carol nodded, patted her arm once, and went downstairs. Diana sat on the edge of the bed and touched the quilt. She ran her thumb along one of the seams, hand-stitched, uneven in the way that handmade things always are, carrying the particular imperfection of a human being working carefully with their hands. She thought about her grandmother, Evelyn, who had died when Diana was 16. A small, compact woman who had survived her own husband's early death, raised 4 children, kept a garden, and never, as far as Diana could remember, allowed herself the luxury of self-pity. She thought about her mother, Ruth, who did not yet know the full details of what had happened. Only that the divorce was final and Diana needed some time. She thought about 12 years. As about a garden she would never plant in again. About a man who had spent 4 years planning his exit while she made dinner and went to work and tended to ordinary life, and believed in her reliable, steady way that she was building something real. She cried. Not loudly. Diana had never been a loud crier. The kind of crying that happens when you've been holding it for so long that your body simply insists. That starts in your chest and moves outward. That empties you out, and when it's over leaves you feeling scraped clean and exhausted, and somehow a little lighter. Carol did not come up. She knew her sister. At some point, Diana lay down, still in her coat, on top of the quilt, and stared at the slanted ceiling, and listened to the house settle, and the wind move through the oak trees outside. And eventually she fell into something that wasn't quite sleep, but was close enough. It was on the 3rd night that she first heard the sound. She was awake at 2 in the morning. She'd been sleeping badly, waking at odd hours, her mind cycling through the divorce proceedings with the particular relentlessness that 2 in the morning specializes in when she heard it. A rustling, coming from the wall behind the dresser. She lay still and listened. It was faint. Not a scratching, exactly, not the irregular skittering of a mouse. It was softer than that. More like paper shifting, like something settling, like the sound a letter makes when you slide it back into its envelope. She told herself it was the house. Old houses have old sounds, beams contracting in the cold, plaster settling, the accumulated creaks and whispers of decades. As she turned over and tried to sleep. She heard it again the next night, and the night after that. By the 4th night, she was sitting up in bed with the lamp on, listening to it actively, trying to locate it precisely. It was definitely coming from behind the dresser, or rather, from inside the wall behind the dresser. It happened only at night, when the house was quiet and the temperature had dropped, and only for a few minutes at a time. Then silence. Then sometimes, once more, softer. She mentioned it to Carol over breakfast. Carol frowned into her coffee. "Could be a mouse," she said. "Or a bird got in somewhere. I'll call someone." But something in Diana resisted that explanation. She had spent enough nights listening to it to feel certain it wasn't an animal. There was no smell, and there was no regularity to it that matched a creature's patterns. And there was something about the sound itself, the quality of it, that felt less like a living thing and more like something inanimate being disturbed, shifted, as though the temperature changes between night and day were causing something inside the wall to move almost imperceptibly, the way paper does, the way old paper does. On the fifth evening after Carol had gone to bed, Diana moved the dresser away from the wall. The plaster behind it was original, she could tell by the texture. Older than the drywall patches visible on other parts of the attic walls, smoother, with a slightly uneven surface that came from being mixed and applied by hand. And there, at floor level, he fitted so precisely into the surrounding plaster that it was essentially invisible unless you were looking for it. A panel. Diana stood very still for a long moment. It was roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall. The edges had been finished so carefully that it would have been completely invisible to anyone who hadn't already moved the furniture and put their face close to the wall. Whoever had made it had taken pains to ensure it wouldn't be found by accident. She went downstairs to Carol's utility drawer and found a flathead screwdriver. When she came back, she knelt in front of the panel. Her hands were not entirely steady. She worked the screwdriver into the seam at the left edge, very gently, feeling for the give point. The plaster held for a moment, held in the way that old things do, stubbornly, and as though reluctant to let go of whatever they've been keeping. Then, with a soft sound that was almost like an exhale, almost like a breath being released after a very long time, the panel came free. A breath of old air moved over her face, cold and dry, with the particular quality of air that has been enclosed for decades, undisturbed, unchanged. She held her phone up and turned on the flashlight. The space inside was perhaps 2 feet deep and 3 feet across. Not a room, not even properly a cavity. More like an intentional shelf, built between the studs with the care of someone who knew what they were doing. The wood inside was old and dry, and arranged on the floor of the cavity, wrapped carefully in oilcloth that had hardened with age, were 4 separate bundles. Diana stared at them for what felt like a very long time, and then she reached in and picked up the first one. The first bundle contained a tin box, about the size of a shoebox, but shallower, sealed with a small brass clasp that had gone green with age. Diana worked the clasp open carefully and lifted the lid. Letters, dozens of them, tied in 3 separate bundles with a faded ribbon that had once been blue. The envelopes were cream-colored and thin, the kind of paper that had been rationed during the war years. The handwriting on the envelopes was careful and slanted, formed with the deliberate elegance of someone who had been taught penmanship as a serious subject. The top envelope was addressed simply, Miss Eleanor Voss, 14 Hartwell Road. No further address. No postage stamp. These letters had been delivered by hand. On the back, in the same handwriting, from Thomas, September 1943. And the second bundle, wrapped in its own piece of oilcloth, contained more letters in a different handwriting, larger, less practiced, formed with more effort and less ornament, but with a certain forcefulness that gave them their own character. The third bundle was a photograph album, soft leather cover that had gone stiff and cracked with age. Diana opened it with the care you'd give something made of glass. The photographs were black and white, mounted on thick cardstock. They showed a young woman, dark hair, dark eyes, a serious face that contained, when you looked at it long enough, the possibility of great warmth. She was perhaps 19 or 20 in the earliest photographs. In several of them she was outside, in a garden, on what appeared to be a porch. And in 2, she was photographed with a young man who wore a military uniform and had a lean, earnest face and eyes that looked directly into the camera with a kind of open, unguarded hopefulness. Diana turned a page and stopped. She was looking at a photograph of a house, shot from the front yard, on what appeared to be a summer day. The house was smaller in the photograph than it was now. Carol had added the back extension years ago, but it was unmistakably this house. The same roofline, the same front porch, the same oak tree, impossibly small in the photograph, that now towered over Elm Creek Road and made the sidewalk uneven. This house, this attic, these walls. The 4th bundle was heavier. Inside the oilcloth was a small wooden jewelry box, its hinged lid carved with a simple pattern of leaves. Inside the box, a thin gold ring worn smooth, a pressed flower, so fragile and brown with age that it was barely holding its shape, and a small note, handwritten, folded 4 times into a tight square. Diana unfolded it with both hands. The handwriting matched the letters in the tin box, and the note said, "For whoever finds this. I hid these things in this wall in the winter of 1943 when Thomas went to France, and I did not know if he would come home. I want whoever finds them to know that they were real, that everything in this box was real, and that some things are worth keeping even when the world tells you to let them go." Evie Diana read the note 3 times. Then she sat back on the attic floor, surrounded by 80 years of someone else's love story, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt curious. She felt the particular urgent pull of an unanswered question. She felt herself leaning forward. She carefully rewrapped everything and carried it all downstairs. Then she knocked softly on Carol's door. Carol opened it in 12 seconds. She had always been a light sleeper. Diana said, "I found something. You need to come and see." They sat at the kitchen table, Carol in her wool cardigan and reading glasses, Fitzgerald on Carol's feet, and they read the letters together, slowly, carefully, as though they might crumble. The letters were a love story, not the sweeping, operatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that happens in the margins of ordinary life between 2 people who have to be careful, who are loving each other against the specific resistance of a world that has decided they shouldn't. Eleanor Voss had been born in 1921, the eldest daughter of Harold Voss, who owned a hardware business and had very fixed ideas about his daughter's life, and who was permitted to be part of it. Thomas Hargrove had been a carpenter's apprentice, the son of a mechanic grown up 2 streets over. They had started writing to each other in the spring of 1941, notes passed through a mutual friend. By summer, they were meeting in secret. Early mornings, brief walks along the creek. By the following winter, they were in love. Thomas's letters were plainly written. Occasional spelling errors, practical syntax, but extraordinarily honest. About his fear that he wasn't good enough for her. About his anger at a world that had decided his worth based on his father's job. And about the particular sweetness of those early morning meetings and how he thought about them throughout every working day. Eleanor's letters were more measured, more careful, with the self-awareness of someone trained to present herself well. But the feeling underneath was just as clear. She wrote about loving someone in secret, about the loneliness of carrying something precious that you can't share openly, about what she called the strange doubling of a life kept in 2 registers. In September 1943, Thomas received his draft notice. The last letter before he shipped out was from Eleanor, the longest in the collection. In it, she told him everything she had been careful about saying. How much she loved him. How afraid she was. what she intended to fight for when he came home. The last line was, "I am going to hide your letters in the attic wall, in the place we talked about so that they are safe while you are away. And I am going to find a way to be brave enough to fight for this when you get back. That is my promise to you." Carol took off her glasses and pressed her fingers to her eyes. Diana said, "He came back. Those are her letters to him in the second bundle. He kept them and returned them." Carol said, quietly, "So what happened to them?" That was the question. That was the question that would drive Diana to the county records office and the library archives and the genealogy databases, with the focused, methodical persistence of a woman who has spent 20 years being very good at finding things. Diana had always been good at research the way some people are good at music, not trained into it exactly, but naturally attuned to it. She had a patience for dead ends that most people didn't. But she could spend an afternoon following a trail that led nowhere, reset, and start again without frustration. She understood that finding things required a kind of non-attachment to outcome. You couldn't want the answer so badly that you stopped listening to what the evidence was actually telling you. She had no job to go to. She had no schedule. She had a laptop and Carol's Wi-Fi and a library card Carol got her within 2 days of her arrival, and for the first time in 20 years, she had nothing but time. She started with the county records, birth records, death records, marriage certificates, property records. Eleanor Voss had been real. Born October 4th, 1921. She had lived at 14 Hartwell Road, not Carol's house, on Elm Creek Road, but a different address, 2 streets away. She had married in August of 1945. And the groom, Harold Prescott, Jr., son of a local banker. Diana looked at the marriage date for a long time. August 1945, 2 months after the last letter in the collection, the letter in which Eleanor had written, "I have done what I had to do, but I want you to know that nothing will ever change what was true between us." Thomas Hargrove, also real. Born March 1920. Discharged from military service in spring of 1945, married Ruth Ann Cleary in 1947, had operated a carpentry business in the county until 1989. Died December 1989. So Thomas had come home. He had come home, and something had happened in the months between his return and Eleanor's August wedding. And whatever it was had been enough to send Eleanor to the altar with Harold Prescott, Jr. Diana dug deeper. She found an obituary for Harold Prescott, Jr. He had died in 1991. A respected businessman, Rotary Club, civic organizations, survived by his wife, Eleanor, and their 3 children. She found Eleanor's obituary from 2003. Died at 82, a woman of deep warmth and quiet strength, beloved by her community and devoted to her family. 3 children, James, Robert, and Patricia. 7 grandchildren. A long and full life. Near the end of the obituary, one line that made Diana go very still. She often said that the most important things in life are the ones we choose to carry with us, and the wisdom to know which ones to set down. Diana read that line 4 times. She kept searching. In the digitized pages of the County Gazette from 1944, she found a small business item. The Voss Hardware Company had come under financial pressure during the war years. Harold Voss had taken out significant loans. At Prescott Bank and Trust, the Prescott family's bank, had extended favorable terms. The Voss Hardware Company had survived. Diana sat back from her laptop. There it was. Not stated. Not explicit. But there, in the dry language of public record, was the shape of what had likely happened. A father in debt, a banker's son, a daughter who had been told, not cruelly perhaps, but clearly, that this was how the family survived, that this was what love looked like when it was practical, when it was responsible. She thought about Eleanor, 23 years old, writing, "I have done what I had to do." She thought about Thomas Hargrove, coming home from France, finding out, going quiet with it, marrying Ruth Ann Cleary 2 years later and building a life. She thought about a tin box in a wall, hidden in the winter of 1943 and left there, because going back to that wall, opening it, reading those letters again, would have been more than Eleanor could bear. But she had left the note. She had left the note addressed to whoever found it because she had needed someone, someday, to know that what she'd hidden there had been real. Diana closed her laptop. She looked at the wall of Carol's kitchen for a long moment. Then she started looking for Patricia. Eleanor's youngest daughter was 73 years old and still living in the county. Diana found her through an alumni database for Jefferson High School. Patricia Prescott, class of 1969, the same school where Carol had taught art for 22 years. The world, Diana thought, was a much smaller place than it appeared from inside a grief. She spent 2 days deciding whether to make contact, and it wasn't obvious that she should. The letters were private, had been intended to remain private. What right did Diana have to walk into an elderly woman's life with a box of her dead mother's secrets? Carol said, Eleanor wrote that note. She addressed it. For whoever finds this. She knew someone might find them someday. She wanted them to be found by someone who needed to find them, and she wanted them to go to someone who could receive them properly. Diana thought about this for a long time. She thought about what it meant to leave a note like that, the deliberateness of it, the hope embedded in it, not a passive hope, but an active one. A message placed in a bottle and sealed inside a wall, addressed to a future that Eleanor couldn't see but chose to believe in anyway. She called the number she had found. As Patricia answered on the third ring, her voice was brisk and warm at the same time, with the particular competence of someone who had spent decades managing their own affairs. Diana explained who she was, where she was staying, what she had found. There was a long pause. Then, Patricia said, "I've wondered about those letters my whole life. My mother mentioned them once when I was about 30. She told me she had hidden something important a long time ago in a house that was no longer in the family, and that she hoped someday it would find its way to someone who could receive it properly. I didn't know what to make of that. I thought maybe she was just being poetic." Diana said, "Would you like to see them?" "Yes," Patricia said. "I very much would." They met the following Thursday. Patricia's house was 20 minutes from Carol's, a small, tidy bungalow with a front garden that Diana noticed with a quiet jolt of recognition was planted with roses and lavender. Patricia was a compact, energetic woman with gray hair cut short and her mother's dark eyes. When Diana laid the tin box and the photograph album and the jewelry box on her kitchen table, she stood very still for a long moment. She looked through the photographs first. She touched her mother's face in the earliest ones, very gently, with one finger, as though she might disturb the image. She read Thomas's last letter before the deployment, and Diana watched the older woman's expression move through something complicated and entirely private. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and set it down and looked up. "She never talked about him," Patricia said. "Not directly. But when I was about 40, she said something I've never forgotten. She said, 'The heart is not a simple instrument. It can love more than one person in more than one way, and neither love cancels the other out. They coexist, sometimes painfully, sometimes peacefully, but they coexist. Diana said nothing. I think she loved my father, Patricia continued. He was a reserved man, not demonstrative, not easy. But I think she found something real in him over the decades, something solid. But I also think she carried Thomas with her. Not as a wound, more like a room she kept locked, not because she was hiding it, but because that was the only way to protect what was inside. She paused. Then she said something that made Diana's breath catch. She was 42 when she stopped grieving him. That was what she told me years later. She said, I was 42. And something released. I stopped carrying the weight of what might have been, and I just started being grateful for what was. The number landed on Diana like a hand pressed flat against her chest. 42. She sat in Carol's driveway for 35 minutes after leaving Patricia's house. The engine was off. The oak trees stood dark and enormous against the November sky. Somewhere 2 streets over, a dog was barking at something unseen, and then it stopped. And the silence was the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. 42. The age Eleanor Voss had been when something, as Patricia said, finally released. When she stopped carrying the weight of what might have been and started being grateful for what was. The age Diana Mercer was now. Right now. Sitting in a car in a driveway with the heat off. Holding the weight of a marriage that had ended and a house that had been taken and 12 years of a life that she had believed in completely, right up until the moment she wasn't supposed to believe in it anymore. She did not believe in signs. She was a practical woman, organized, reliable, the kind of person who checked her facts and read the whole email and did not assume that the universe was arranging things for her personal instruction. But she sat in that driveway and she thought about Eleanor, 23 years old, hiding those letters in a wall with a note addressed to whoever finds this. Not knowing who, not knowing when, just trusting. Having the specific faith that what is real does not vanish, it only waits. She thought about what it meant to carry things. Now she had been carrying her grief like a debt she owed herself, as though she was required to feel the full weight of every one of those 12 years, every piece of evidence she had missed, every moment she had chosen to believe the explanation rather than the feeling underneath the explanation. She thought about Eleanor, who had carried Thomas quietly for decades and had still built a full and warm and devoted life, who had loved her garden and her children and her community without being diminished by what she also, privately, carried. The heart is not a simple instrument. She thought about Marcus, about 12 years, about the parts that had been real, the Sunday mornings, the running jokes, the warmth of 2 people who know how to move through a space together. Those things had been real. They had coexisted with the deception, and she was not going to let the deception retroactively unmake them. She could grieve what was real. She could release what was not. She could carry what was worth keeping. She could set down what wasn't. She sat in the driveway until the cold became uncomfortable. Then she went inside. Carol was in the kitchen. She looked at Diana's face and didn't ask any questions. She poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of Diana's chair. Diana sat down. She wrapped both hands around the mug. She said, she was 42 when she let it go. Eleanor. She was exactly my age. Carol looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Are you ready to let something go?" Diana thought about it. Really thought about it. The way you think about a question that deserves a true answer, rather than a convenient one. She said, "I think I'm starting to be." Nick Carroll nodded. She picked up her tea. Outside, the wind moved through the oak trees. The house settled around them. Somewhere in the attic, the round window let in a thin stripe of moonlight across the floor, where the dresser no longer stood against the wall. Diana stayed in Carroll's attic for 9 more months. She found work at the County Historical Society. The skills she had spent 20 years applying to financial administration, organizing, cross-referencing, finding the thread in a tangle of competing documents, making the scattered legible, translated beautifully into the work of archiving. She was very good at it, better in some ways than she had been at the work she'd done before, because this time the work felt like it mattered in a direction she could see. Patricia Prescott donated the letters, the photographs, and the jewelry box to the Historical Society. A small display case was made. A brief write-up was prepared, describing Eleanor and Thomas's story in the context of the wartime county. It became, quietly, one of the most visited displays in the building. People stood in front of it for a long time. In the spring, Diana found a small apartment. First floor, a back garden that the landlord said she could do whatever she liked with. She bought roses and lavender and a pack of flat stones for a path she laid by hand one Saturday afternoon in April, pressing each stone into the earth carefully, measuring the spacing by eye, the way she had done it the first time. Carol came over the first Sunday and sat on the back step with her coffee and watched. "You look different," Carol said. "I feel different," Diana said. "Good different." Diana pressed a stone into the earth, looked at the line of the path she was building, small and real and hers. She thought about Eleanor Voss, who had been 42 years old when something finally let go, who had gone on to build a full and devoted life without ever pretending that she hadn't lost something real, who had loved her garden and her children and her community, and who had left a note in a wall because she believed that what is buried does not die. It waits for the right person to find it. She thought about a tin box, a pressed flower, a gold ring worn smooth, a message addressed for whoever finds this. She thought about herself, at 42, pulling a dresser away from a wall in the dark. "Yeah," she said. "Good. Different." She pressed her hands into the earth and kept planting. If this story moved you, if something in it landed somewhere you needed it to land, I'm glad you were here for it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we tell stories like this every single week. Stories about ordinary people, hidden histories, and the unexpected places where healing quietly finds us. If you're going through something hard right now, I just want you to know, the attic is not the end. The wall has something in it, and you are exactly the right person to find